there are people in President Trump's inner circle who realize that Russia really isn't very serious about this. And so he might, in the end, take a tougher line on Russia, or he might walk away from the talks, which he's also threatened to do. But we're not there yet.
Ukraine's President Zelensky has said he is prepared to meet President Putin in Turkey later this week and hopes Donald Trump will realise that the Russian leader is the real obstacle to a peace deal. Thursday could see the first direct talks between Russia and Ukraine for more than 3 years, but it's unclear whether President Putin himself would attend. Trump's Ukraine envoy, Keith Kellogg, has suggested the potential for a three-way summit after President Trump hinted that he might go. Kellogg is expected to be there with the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Trump's Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff. Angela Stent is a former US National Intelligence Officer for Russia and a former senior NATO advisor. Good evening to you, Angela.
Good evening.
Well, there seemed to be a great deal of brinkmanship about who's even going to attend these talks on Thursday in Turkey. Do you think there are real prospects of a breakthrough here?
I don't. So what happened was on Saturday, you had the coalition of the willing, Prime Minister Starmer, President Macron, Chancellor Merz, and Prime Minister Tusk from Poland in Kiev with Zelensky, and they agreed on a plan. There has to be a ceasefire, and then negotiations will begin. Well, when Putin found out about that, he doesn't want a ceasefire. He's not interested in ending the war. So he then held a midnight press conference on Saturday night saying that there were going to be direct negotiations between Russia and Ukraine in Turkey. So at that point, he didn't say he was going. President Zelensky quite rightly said, fine. I'm going to go to Turkey, and he is indeed. President Zelensky will fly to Ankara and meet with President Erdogan of Turkey, who would like to be a mediator, and was when the first peace talks took place in March and April of 2022. And after that, he said, why doesn't President Trump come? And President Trump is in the Middle East, as we've just heard. And he said, he might come, but if Putin's there. I think what's going to happen is you're going to get General Kellogg, as you said, you're going to get Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Mr. Witkoff. They will go to Istanbul. Zelensky will be there, but he says he will only meet with Putin. He won't meet with other Russian negotiators. And so the speculation now is it'll probably be Foreign Minister Lavrov and maybe a couple of other people who've already met with the Americans before in Saudi Arabia. But I think it's highly unlikely that President Putin will show up. He's doing this because immediately when he announced it on Saturday night, President Trump tweeted, this is great, Zelensky, you have to go. And Zelensky is indeed going. But it's a way of procrastinating and putting off any real ceasefire.
So do you think that the fundamental problem here is that President Putin doesn't actually want a ceasefire and he's just playing along with this, which is what many people have suspected he's doing to try to keep on side with President Trump?
That's exactly what he's doing. He doesn't want a ceasefire, but what he does want is the second track, if you like, of the US-Russian negotiations, which is the restoration of relations, the lifting of sanctions on Russia, the prospect of business deals that the American private sector will do with Russia, the possibility of President Trump's family doing business deals there. That's what Putin wants. He wants this recognition. He wants to come out from the cold and not be isolated anymore from the West. He is not interested in ending the war because he still thinks that Russia's winning.
And what about President Trump? I mean, we get so many conflicting signals, don't we? At one stage, he did say that he feared that President Putin might be stalling. Do you think there is any realistic prospect that President Trump is going to turn around and say and lose patience with President Putin and realize what everyone else seems to have realized, that President Putin doesn't actually want to end this war, certainly not at the moment?
So we've had President Trump occasionally criticize President Putin. He told him to stop bombing. And he has occasionally said, if Russia isn't serious, we will impose more sanctions and will support Ukraine more. But so far, he hasn't done anything. And what it looks like is as if he is bending over backwards to give Putin, the president, the benefit of the doubt. and hope that Putin will come round. But one does understand that there are people in President Trump's inner circle who realize that Russia really isn't very serious about this. And so he might, in the end, take a tougher line on Russia, or he might walk away from the talks, which he's also threatened to do. But we're not there yet.
And President Zelensky, as you say, he accepted that idea of a 30-day ceasefire, which was proposed by Sir Keir Starmer and this so-called coalition of the willing. President Zelensky now seems to be doing just about everything he possibly can to try and keep on the right side of President Trump after that disastrous confrontation in the Oval Office a month or two back.
He definitely is. I mean, they did have this 15-minute meeting at the funeral of the Pope, and that obviously enabled them to improve relations. And Ukraine has signed this minerals and economic deal with the United States, which in theory will get U.S. business involved in Ukraine in excavating their minerals, and there will be a robust U.S. business presence there. And that's definitely what President Trump wanted. And now we're hearing that the U.S. is willing now to sell weapons to Ukraine, whereas before it wasn't. So Zelensky is very carefully watching President Trump. He's doing everything he can to please President Trump in the hopes that U.S. support will continue, irrespective of what happens during the war.
That minerals deal, presumably, is absolutely worthless unless there is some form of peace, isn't it? Because there's no way any of those minerals can be exploited or brought out while the war is continuing.
Well, of course not. And also, it's going to take 5 to 10 years, to excavate them, to refine them. And, your listeners should realize it's China that does most of the refining of these rare earths from around the world. So it's a very complicated question about when is somebody going to start making money from this? But at least it's been signed, and in principle, the U.S. could do quite well if the war ends and if it's possible to excavate these rare earth minerals. It's also oil and gas is part of this deal as well. But again, that's a long lead time to get the oil and gas out of the ground.
Just in the meantime, I mean, we've had that meeting of Sir Keir Starmer, this coalition of the willing. That also, I mean, does that amount to very much if there's no peace to maintain?
So I think much of what was discussed in Kyiv and between the European leaders is what they would do after the war is over. And that would involve security guarantees, at least from Europe. For Ukraine, it would involve more military assistance, economic assistance, using some of the interest, at least from the Russian frozen assets, possibly boots on the ground as a stabilization force in Western Ukraine, although I gather that Prime Minister Starmer has now said that probably wouldn't be true for the British. But again, that's all contingent on the fighting stopping. As long as it's going on, there can certainly be more European assistance to Ukraine, but it will take all of those European countries some time to produce enough weapons to give Ukraine what it really needs.
Angela Stent, former US National Intelligence Officer for Russia, a former senior NATO advisor. Really good to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carl.